All right, in this episode, we're going to cover the parable of the unjust steward that's found in Luke 16. I skipped over this with the other couple episodes of Come Follow Me. It's a difficult parable to understand, and it would have taken some time, but I did want to get it in here for reference. So here we go. We're going to cover this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and read through the parable, and then we're going to take a look at a few different interpretations and ideas that I have that help us to, maybe put this puzzle together just a little bit. And he said also unto his disciples. Now this is a change that many commentators point out with this parable, where originally, remember, he's sitting with the publicans and the sinners. The Pharisees come along and say, "Why are you sitting with them?" Well, his first parables here address the Pharisees. We have the story of the lost sheep. We have the story of the lost coin with the woman. We have the story of the lost son or the prodigal son. And now he turns and he speaks to his disciples with this parable. There was a certain rich man which had a steward, and the same was accused unto him that he had wasted his goods. And he called him and said unto him, How is it that I hear this of thee? Give an account of thy stewardship, for thou mayest be no longer steward. Then the steward said within himself, What shall I do? For my Lord taketh away from me the stewardship. I cannot dig, to beg I am ashamed. I am resolved what to do, that when I am put out of the stewardship, they may receive me into their houses. So he called every one of his Lord's debtors unto him, and said unto the first, How much owest thou unto my Lord? And he said, 100 measures of oil. And he said unto him, Take thy bill, and sit down quickly, and write 50. Then said he to another, And how much owest thou? And he said, 100 measures of wheat. And he said unto him, Take thy bill, and write 80. And the Lord commended the unjust steward, because he had done wisely. For the children of this world are in their generation wiser than the children of light. Now we're going to stop here at the end of verse 8. This parable may stop right here. It might even stop in the middle of verse 8. And one of the problems with interpreting this parable is everything that follows afterwards seems to be kind of an explanation or a follow-up to the parable. But it might not be. And so if we're trying to put all the pieces of the puzzle together, then we go ahead and bring all of the follow-up here from Jesus and his comments into the parable. We'll do that in a minute. So let's go back to the beginning of this parable and dissect it a little bit and talk about some of the interpretations that commentators have given us previously. And he said unto his disciples, verse 1, There was a certain rich man which had a steward. So we don't know who's who here. That's one of the problems. We assume that the rich man or the master here is the Lord, and he very well may be. But we don't know that because he acts a little strange in this. He is commending the unjust steward for fraudulent or unjust work, which seems very odd. So let's keep going. And the same was accused unto him that he had wasted his goods. So the steward is not taking care of things. You think of the steward as someone who's in charge of the financial endeavors here, of the financial administration of the master. And he's not taking care of things. Things are falling apart. And he called him and said unto him, How is it that I hear this of thee? Give an account of thy stewardship, for thou mayest be no longer steward. So he's being put on notice. You're going to be fired based on how the accounting comes out here. Then the steward said within himself, What shall I do? For my Lord taketh away from me the stewardship. I cannot dig, to beg I am ashamed. So labor is not really in the cards for this steward, and they're too ashamed to go out and beg. So they need to secure their future and find out a way to secure an income in the future. He says, I am resolved what to do, that when I am put out of the stewardship, they may receive me into their homes. So it appears that what he's doing is he's going to come up with a plan here that he's going to go to the debtors of the master and figure out a way that they're going to like him and probably hire him in the future to maybe look over some of their finances. And so he called every one of his Lord's debtors unto him and said unto the first, how much owest thou unto my Lord? Right? And then he goes through this process, and Jesus gives a couple of examples of him lowering the debt on these two people that they owe to the rich man, to the master. What's interesting is the examples that they give, which is having to do with 100 measures of oil and 100 measures of wheat. The amount seems to be different that's lowered, but the actual value that it's lowered is the same. The total debt is different, but the actual value that it's lowered, not percentage-wise, but the actual value is the same. And when he does this, then the master commends him for what he's doing because he's done wisely. And then we get this interesting statement here from Jesus. For the children of this world are in their generation wiser than the children of light. So why would he say that again? Here's another example of something that seems turned on its head. For the children of this world are in their generation wiser than the children of light. So if we go back to Talmage's example, what he says is that the unjust steward, realizing that the judgment was coming, so to speak, he goes back to the debtors, and the amount that he reduces the debt is actually the amount that would be for him, for the steward. So he goes around to these individuals, and he has to bring a debt back to the master, a certain amount. But to do that, it would be common for whoever's going to be doing the collection to charge something on top of that. That would be very common. Allows for a lot of corruption. We see this in a lot of the third world countries still today, but that's what would have been common back then. And so perhaps that's true. Perhaps he goes out and he reduces the bill, and instead of reducing what is owed to the master, he reduces what his take is, which would be a large sum, a large percentage of it, and therefore brings that back to the master. And so the master gets exactly what he's expecting, but the steward gets nothing out of it. And therefore, the master, the rich man, would commend him for collecting all the debts and getting this taken care of. It's not the best scenario. He should have been doing this all along. But once he was put into a position where he had to really start looking out for his future, he takes care of things. And the master commends him for it. The other thing that we might look at is what McConkie says. McConkie goes into a little bit more of an explanation of how this is a very worldly type of a scenario. And it may very well be that the master is also worldly and not actually an example of the Lord. But here is a real world example where they're going out and the unjust steward is securing an income for himself for the future. And that the parable is taught because Jesus says this is just how someone would take care of themselves financially and start looking after their future. Someone who is lost spiritually needs to do the same thing. And that the children of this world are in their generation wiser than the children of light. Well, and it says in their generation, it may very well mean that in their world, the world of mammon, that would mean riches and greed, that they do a much better job of making sure they're looking out for themselves financially and for their future than many people do spiritually in looking out for themselves in their future, their eternity. And so therefore, he would be telling the parable, giving this comparison of the higher law and the lower law, using again economy, using the spiritual economy and the temporal economy as an example, like he oftentimes does. This is Luke, as he oftentimes does throughout all of his gospel. At this point, let's follow up a little bit with what Jesus says after the parable. He says, "And I say unto you, make to yourselves friends of the mammon of unrighteousness." So when you talk about mammon, you're talking about greed. You're talking about money. Make to yourselves friends of the mammon of unrighteousness, that when ye fail, they may receive you into everlasting habitations. So, the idea here from the commentators is, again, that make friends with temporal needs. In other words, you have to work within this. You have to work within these parameters, and there are no options. And if you look at the example here, there is an example, I believe, in section 82 that has a very similar language to this whole chapter, where the Lord tells Joseph Smith, when they're talking about the United Order, that you need to make friends with mammon to make things work financially. And in other words, you can't totally stand back and not deal at all with money in this world. It doesn't work. You'll never get anywhere. It's impossible, unfortunately. But you can't do that. You have to work within the temporal economy, even when you are looking for a spiritual end. And that's what McConkie is saying. And apparently that's what the Lord is saying to Joseph Smith in section 82. And then if we go down a little bit further into verse 10, he says, "He that is faithful in that which is least is faithful also in much." So this would kind of be like the parable of the talents. Even if you have a smaller amount, but you're faithful in that, that actually shows that you're faithful in a lot. You can be faithful in a lot. "And he that is unjust in the least, is unjust also in much." So if you have a little bit entrusted unto you and you can't handle that, then you probably can't receive a lot more. You're going to be unjust also when there's a lot more that is given to you. Similar principle. And then he goes down to verse 13, and here's where we have a verse that we're all familiar with. "No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. Ye cannot serve God and mammon." So you have to have an option here. And this is another window into possibly this parable that is hard to find the answer to, I believe. But it seems that he's referring back to the mammon here. And he's saying, become friends of mammon, but don't worship mammon, right? You need to become friends of mammon and greed, but the temporal economy, but do not worship it. You have to serve one or the other. And then in verse 14, we get something important here, a little bit of information. "And the Pharisees," because they're still there, even though Jesus is now addressing the disciples, "and the Pharisees also, who were covetous." And what he's saying here is they're greedy. Greedy would be the better word, I think. They are greedy. They love money. And we're told that a few times here in the Gospels. They heard all these things and they derided him. So this is another clue here. Why are they deriding him? Why do they feel attacked in this situation? I think that's a good question to help unravel the parable and its meaning. Who are the Pharisees? Are they the Lord, or not the Lord? Are they the master or the rich man? Because in the next parable, in the rich man and Lazarus, they are the rich man. Are they the unjust steward? And they're fraudulent and don't take care of things. Is the responsibility coming from the rich man or the master to the unjust steward, and they're not taking care of things? And that's the Pharisees. The Lord is using them as a steward, and they're unjust stewards, being the Pharisees. Is that possible? And then a couple more quick things here I want to go over. In verse 16, it says, "The law and the prophets were until John," being John the Baptist. "Since that time the kingdom of God is preached, and every man presseth into it." So there is a Joseph Smith translation of this where there's actually quite a few verses that are inserted right about here. Unfortunately, they're not inserted in the parable of the unjust steward. If they were right in that area, we'd get something much more clear probably. But they still might give us a window into what the parable is about. His verses are all about, as he has inserted throughout most of the Joseph Smith translation, but especially here in Luke and in Matthew, he inserts information about how the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes, etc., have a dead law. And they only are focused on the lower law and not on the higher law. And so he's saying, you've had this law the whole time, but you don't understand it. And you don't understand that it looks forward to me, as he says in the Joseph Smith translation. You've got the law, you don't follow it, and you don't look at it and understand it. Because if you did, you would realize that the prophets all prophesied of me, is what he says there. So we get this higher law, lower law, and the idea of Jesus being the Messiah, the Son of God. And then one more point that comes up here that is mentioned in Luke 16, but is emphasized in the Joseph Smith translation, is that of adultery, that the Pharisees seem to be in a practice of taking a wife and then putting her away, that is, giving her a divorcement, and then taking another wife. And so it sounds like that's what's happening here with them, and that they are in positions of power, that they're greedy, and that they are looking only out for themselves and not taking care of their wives and their children, because Joseph Smith specifically talks about them taking the children and offending the children as well. So Pharisees here are not shed in a very good light by Jesus at all. So in looking at the Joseph Smith translation, a couple things that come up that Jesus seems to be talking about are that they are not good stewards. And in that sense, maybe they are the unjust steward. Maybe they are not taking care of things because they're covetous and they are after money themselves. And this unjust steward in the parable actually made a change, but the Pharisees don't. And they don't take care of their stewardship that they've been given. And maybe it's their homes. Maybe they don't take care of even their own homes and their own wives and their own children. Joseph Smith specifically says that they get mad at Jesus for him saying that they are adulterers. So are they offended? And that's what the unjust steward represents, is they are not stewards of their own home. I think that's a real possibility in looking at what Joseph Smith inserts here as well. One more last thought on this. And no, I don't have a for sure conclusion on this, unfortunately. There's a lot of moving parts here. But there's one more thought here that I had. If you go back and you look at all of these parables that Jesus is teaching in this moment, in this time, remember what the setting is. He is sitting with the publicans and the sinners. And the Pharisees come, and that's the first thing that they are upset about. Why are you sitting with the publicans and the sinners? How can you do that? And so then he starts going into the parables and seems to be talking about the publicans and the sinners, right? So we have the parable of the lost sheep. So that lost sheep could be the publicans and the sinners. They've moved off on their own, they're lost, and they need to be brought back in, right? The unhealthy, the sick, are the ones that need a physician, is something that Jesus says. The lost coin with the woman, lost and need to be brought in, looking at the publicans and the sinners. A lost prodigal son goes off, and like the steward, he doesn't handle his stewardship very well, the money that's been given to him, his responsibilities, and he needs to come back. And all of these instances give us a couple of examples here that are really important. One is about the individual It's very important that we see that in each of these parables, there's a real concern for the individual, not the collective, but for the individual and their repentance, and that they've been found and brought back. So that's one key point. But another one is about covenant. Remember that covenant is the splitting apart, the being lost, and then coming back together again. That's what the gospel is about. That's what the plan of salvation is about. And that's what these parables up to now have all seemed to be about. Something is pulled apart or lost and then brought back together. And who is the central character in those examples? The central character in the lost sheep is not the lost sheep, it's the shepherd. And how glad the shepherd is for finding the one, and he left the 99 to find the one. The central character is not the money, the coin that the woman lost. It's the woman who is so happy that she found the coin. The central character, even though we call it the prodigal son, again, if you listen to my episode on that, and you look at the chiasmus in there, where the center of that chiasmus is not the son, it's the father. The father is the central figure in that story, who is so excited, like the others, that what he has lost has come back. And why the whole emphasis on how exciting that is? That is the major thrust of what Jesus is teaching in these parables, is the excitement. I know there's 99 other sheep, but how excited are you when you when you find the one, and the shepherd has the feast? And how excited the woman is when she finds the one. And how excited the father is when the prodigal son comes back and they kill the fatted calf and the other son is wondering what's going on. That's the focus of the story, not the lost person, even though it does focus on the individual, and we understand that principle very well. The focus, though, is on the excitement of the central character. And what does that excitement represent? To me, as I go through that, what it represents to me is mercy. It is mercy. It is these things have been lost, and now they come back. And I'm not going to keep a judgment like with the prodigal son. Hey, other son, you've been doing a great job, but I'm not going to keep punishing this other son who is now returned to me. Right? I'm going to give mercy. It is the higher law that he is giving. It is the higher law that Jesus is focusing on here with these parables of mercy. And remember the setting. He is talking to the Pharisees while the publicans and the sinners are there. And the Pharisees can't stand that he is there sitting with the sinners and the publicans. And Jesus is trying to teach them this lesson about mercy. So what if we applied that same law and that same emphasis that we've had so far in those previous parables to the parable of the lost, or the parable of the unjust steward? Here's how this might work. The rich man, or the master, would be the Lord, as he seems to be represented as the central figure in all of the others. And he has given out a stewardship to someone who is not handling things very well. Now we bring in another character that perhaps we haven't thought of in this parable that does exist but is unnamed. And if we go back to verse 1, we find this other character. It says here, there was a certain rich man which had a steward. So there's two of the characters. And the same was accused unto him, unto the master, unto the rich man, that he had wasted his goods. In verse 2, he follows up when he says, how is it that I hear this of thee? So we have another character that we haven't probably thought about. Who is it? It's the accuser. And the accuser almost always is a negative representation. Remember that it's Lucifer in the book of Revelation, in the pre-existence, whose title is, John gives as the accuser. And if you go throughout all of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they all bring up accusers and accused, and it's almost always, with just a couple of exceptions, it's almost always geared toward the Pharisees and the scribes, or the high priests. Because in a trial situation, it's the accuser in a spiritual scenario that is evil. And it's Christ who is the advocate, who is the defender, if you will, of each of us. And so we have another character here who is the accuser. So what if we applied that same scenario and made the accuser the Pharisees, who, even though they're not being talked to directly, are certainly there? And they have accused the ones who have not taken care of their stewardship very well, or the people that are, as we look at the other parables, the sinners. Well, here Jesus is speaking to the sinners and the publicans. And the Pharisees are accusing the publicans and the sinners of being sinners. And then what is the example of the parable? It's exactly what the publicans do. That's what a publican is. They work typically for Rome, or maybe other jurisdictions under Rome, and they go around and they collect the taxes. And as they go around and collect the taxes, they grab a little bit more on top of it for themselves. That's why they're hated. That's why they are with the sinners, and they usually deal with money, and they don't deal very well with it. So what if the publicans and the sinners here are the unjust steward? And we would point them out, or Jesus would point them out as the unjust steward, because that's what the Pharisees would label them. And that's what all the Gospels label these publicans and sinners. And remember, Matthew was a publican. He was a tax collector, and he became an apostle with Jesus here. So if these are the publicans and the sinners, maybe Jesus is reaching out an olive branch, so to speak, to the publicans and sinners, who many commentators believe in this exact situation became converted. And they who had been publicans and sinners and were come to judgment, I mean, here's Jesus right there in front of them. They then go out, they reduce, as Talmage would say, their cut of the money, and they bring back the original debt back to the master, and the master says, well done. In other words, they repent, and they do what they're supposed to do and become a part of the master. And that would make everything line up in this parable. That would make everything make sense, even what follows. Because what follows then is that the Pharisees are outraged about this parable as well as the others. So they understand that they're the accusers and that Jesus is the judge. And they're not going to have, as Joseph Smith says, they're not going to have him be their judge, just like Laman and Lemuel say about Nephi. And it would make sense going along with the lower and the higher laws that Joseph Smith focuses on, where the temporal economy here is used as an example for a spiritual economy. It would make sense going in with all of the previous parables where we're talking about something being lost for a while and then returned into good graces. And it would be consistent to be calling the Pharisees the accusers here. So that's another thought that I hadn't seen before or read before that we could look at as an example of what Jesus might be doing here with this parable. I'll talk to you next time.